and welcome to the next video in the S3 course. In this video, we'll talk about S3 access control and permissions. We'll cover 5 things in this video. The first is user policy, bucket policy, and access control list. We'll look at the parts of the policy, and we'll look at 3 use cases in order to understand how to write policies to control access to an S3 bucket. So we'll look at how to write a user policy to allow S3 bucket listing, get input objects. We'll also look at a bucket policy to deny access to a bucket except to specific users, and we'll end with a bucket policy to allow cross-account access. So let's get started. This accompanying block has all the content that I'll be using for this video. In S3, there are 3 different kinds of permissions. So let's say if you have a user who wants to access the bucket, a user that wants to access a bucket. The bucket itself has what we call a bucket policy. The bucket policy determines what any user is allowed to do in that bucket. A user also has what is known as a user policy. The user policy essentially gives the user right to perform actions on the bucket. The user policy is generally given by the administrator. Besides the bucket and user policy, we also have what is known as an access control list or ACL. ACL are used in very specific conditions, and we look at what those conditions are. Access control lists are used mainly in 2 conditions. That is, when the objects are uploaded by another account and the bucket owner does not own these objects. The object owner can then write ACL to manage them. The second case is when bucket ACL is used to grant permission to Amazon S3 log delivery group to write access log to that bucket. In all other cases, it's better to use bucket policies or user policies. To understand more how bucket policy and user policies work, let's look at an example of both a user policy and a bucket policy. Now in my account, I've created a new user called user A, and I've given the following policy to that user. The policy is in 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to allow the user to get and list all buckets. In the second part, I'm going to allow the user to list all objects in my bucket. And in the third part, I'm going to allow the user to put and get and delete objects from my bucket. I specify the bucket name as a resource. There are essentially 3 parts to IAM. The first is effect, whether you want to allow or deny. The second is an action. What kind of action do you want the user to perform? And the third is resource. Where do you want the action to be performed? So to list all buckets or to get bucket location, I'll need to allow access to all S3 objects. To allow listing objects in a particular bucket, I'll have to pass in the bucket name. And the same goes with put, get, and delete objects. This user policy, if given to a user, would allow him to list all the buckets, list all the objects in study trails S3 course bucket, and then also put, get, and delete objects in that bucket. Now the question is when to use a user policy and when to use a bucket policy. And the answer is it depends. But in most cases, if you have less users, then makes sense to write a user policy. Also, you can group users into a group and give that group a policy. Bucket policy is generally written when you want to deny access to all the users except a few chosen users. And let's look at that next. In the second example, I've written a bucket policy to deny access to a bucket except to specific users. So in this case, the effect is deny. Principal is star because I want to deny to all users except for the ones that I specify later on. Action is all actions in S3, and the resource is S3 bucket and everything inside the bucket. So the slash star that you see, that is used to denote all objects within that bucket. It's a wildcard character. The other wildcard character is a question mark that can replace one character, but slash star replaces everything inside that bucket. Now I want to deny permissions to all the users except where the user has an ID of the account number. Now we specify the account number as the ID. This is the root user. And I also want to allow one another user. Now to get the user ID, one way is to use your CLI and fire this command. This command will give you the ID of the user. One last thing we'll look at is the bucket policy to allow cross-account access. Sometimes you have your objects in account A and you want to give access to account B or account C. In that case, the steps are first, create your bucket in account A. Second, write the bucket policy in account A that allows access to the root in account B. So in this case, what we have done is we have said that for account B, and this is my account B, and I'm giving permission to root. This will allow the root user to list the bucket and the contents of the bucket for StudyTales S3 course. Now, although we have given permission to only the root user, this root user in account B can now delegate the permissions to the user. So if you have user B in account B, the root user can then write a user policy that allows that user B permission to this bucket. Now let's look at the management console and see where the bucket policy and user policy are written. So if I go to this bucket and if I click on the bucket, I go to the permissions section. And if I scroll down, this is where you can see the bucket policy. If you see in the bucket policy, I've given access to these two users, and I've also given access to the different account. Let's also look at the IAM policy that is attached to that new user. So if you go to IAM and click on users, I've created a new user called user A, and I've given a policy called user A policy. If you click on edit policy and JSON, this is where you can type in the policy for a user. So this particular user, user A, is allowed to list all buckets and is also allowed to list contents of StudyTales S3 course and upload and download objects onto it. X3 access permission is a very complicated topic, but what I've shown here are the basics of what you would need in a normal project. If you want to learn more, look at the S3 documentation or put in your comments and I'll be happy to help you. See you in the next video.